High in the Great Smoky Mountains, where the fog settles so thick in the hollows that a man can lose a trail he has walked 100 times, there are stories older than the United States, older than the colonies, older, some say, than the Cherokee themselves. And the strangest of them all is the one almost nobody will tell you out loud. It is the story of the ones who were here first, the tall ones, the pale ones, who could not stand the light of the sun. The ones the Cherokee elders described to the men who came with notebooks and pencils, the ones who wrote it all down in the early years of the last century and then, somehow, let it slip out of the history books entirely. They were said to be giants. 7, 8, even 9 feet tall. And the detail that the old accounts keep returning to, the detail that should have made everyone stop and pay attention, is the one nobody can quite explain. On each hand, 6 fingers. On each foot, 6 toes. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. This is the story the Cherokee told. And this is what happened to it. To understand what was recorded in those mountains, you have to understand the mountains themselves. The Appalachians are among the oldest landforms on the face of the earth. Long before the Rockies pushed up out of the western plains, long before the Alps folded into the sky over Europe, these ridges were already ancient. They have been worn down by something close to 500 million years of rain and frost and slow geological patience. What you see today are not really mountains in the way the young ranges are mountains. They are the roots of mountains. The stumps of something that was once far taller, far sharper, far more terrible, and the people who lived in their shadow knew them better than anyone. The Cherokee called themselves the Ani-Yunwiya, the principal people, and their homeland stretched across what is now western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, northern Georgia, and the edges of several other states. They had been there for a very long time. Long enough to have a story for every river bend, every waterfall, every strange rock formation that did not look like it belonged. But here is the thing that the early ethnographers kept stumbling over. When they asked the Cherokee about the oldest mounds, the oldest earthworks, the strange stone walls high up on the ridgelines, the answer was almost always the same. We did not build these. They were here before us. They were built by the ones who came before. And when they pressed for who, exactly, came before, the stories got very strange indeed. In the year 1900, a man named James Mooney published a volume for the Bureau of American Ethnology. It was called Myths of the Cherokee, and it was the product of years of patient work, sitting with Cherokee elders, listening, transcribing, asking the same questions a dozen different ways to make sure he understood. Mooney was no sensationalist. He was a serious scholar, and his collection is still considered one of the foundational records of Cherokee oral tradition. You can find it in university libraries to this day. And inside that careful, scholarly volume, alongside the stories of the rabbit trickster and the origin of the constellations, Mooney recorded something else. He recorded the giant. His name was Tzul'kalu. In English, the syllables get smoothed down to Judaculla. He was described as a great giant, a being of enormous size, a master of the hunt and the lord of all the game animals in the mountains. The Cherokee said his eyes were set at a slant, sloping, unlike the eyes of ordinary men. They said he was so large that when he sat down, the impressions of his body remained pressed into the solid stone of the mountainside. They could show you the places. They are still there. One of them sits in what is now Jackson County, North Carolina. It is a boulder covered in carvings, swirls and shapes and figures that no one has ever fully translated. The Cherokee called it the place where Judaculla left his mark. Among the carvings, the old stories said, was the print of the giant's hand where he steadied himself as he leapt from his mountain. And the print, according to those who claimed to have seen it before erosion softened the stone, did not have 5 fingers. It had 7. Now, you can stand in front of that rock today. It is a real place. The carvings are real. They are weathered now, harder to read than they once were, and the experts will tell you they are likely petroglyphs of considerable but ordinary human age, the work of ancestral hands marking something sacred. That is the careful explanation, and it may well be the true one. But the stories the Cherokee told about why those marks were there, and who pressed them into the rock, did not match the careful explanation at all. The stories said a giant did it, and the giant was not built like a man. Here is where the account turns, because Judaculla was not the only memory the Cherokee carried of a people who were not quite people. There was another, and this one was even older, even stranger, and far more troubling. The Cherokee spoke of a race they called the Moon-Eyed people. The name itself tells you almost everything. They were called moon-eyed because they could not bear the light of the sun. By day they were nearly blind, helpless, forced to shelter in caves and in the deep shadow of the forest. But by night, under the moon, they could see perfectly. They moved through the dark woods with confidence while the rest of the world slept. They built in the dark, they lived in the dark, and the Cherokee said they were pale, far paler than any human the elders had ever seen, with skin like something that had never been touched by sunlight at all. This is not a modern invention. The Moon-Eyed people appear in the written record going back to the 1700s. A naturalist named Benjamin Smith Barton wrote about them in 1797, recording the Cherokee account that a pale, moon-eyed people had inhabited the land before them and had been driven west. Pushed off the land in a war that, according to the oldest versions of the story, the Cherokee themselves won. And there is a place tied to this story too. Up on Fort Mountain in northern Georgia, there is a wall. A long, low wall of stacked stone running for hundreds of feet along the ridge, in places nearly 7 feet high. No one knows who built it. No one knows why. It does not match the building style of any tribe the historians can name. The Cherokee, when asked, gave the same answer they always gave. We did not build it. The moon-eyed ones built it. The ones who were here before. The pale ones. The night-seeing ones. The ones who were driven out. You can feel already how this story refuses to sit quietly in the box where conventional history wants to put it. And the moon-eyed people were not the only inhabitants the Cherokee remembered sharing these mountains with. There were also the Nunahee. The name is usually translated as something close to the people who live anywhere, or the immortals. The Cherokee said they were a spirit race, a hidden people who lived inside the mountains themselves, in townhouses beneath the high peaks and beneath the deep pools of the rivers. They were not described as monstrous. They were described as beautiful, and as kind, and as immortal, and as fond of music and dancing, the sound of which a lost traveller might sometimes hear drifting up out of the rock, with no source he could ever find. The Nunahee were said to be invisible when they wished to be, and to reveal themselves only to those they chose. They were protectors. In the oldest stories, when the Cherokee faced disaster, the immortals were said to have come up out of the mountains to fight beside them. And when the worst day finally arrived, when the soldiers came to drive the Cherokee west on the road that would become known as the Trail of Tears, the stories say the Nunahee opened the mountains and offered shelter to any who would come and live with them forever, hidden beyond the reach of the men who were stealing the land. Spirit people inside the mountains, pale people who feared the sun, giants who pressed their bodies into solid stone. This was not one strange story. It was a whole population of strangeness, layered into the same range of hills, remembered by the same people, told to the same patient men with their notebooks. And not one of these traditions has ever been comfortably explained. So let us go to the giants directly, because the six-fingered detail is where everything in this account converges, and it is where the story becomes almost impossible to dismiss as simple imagination. Across the early 1800s and into the early 1900s, something happened across the eastern United States that historians today still find genuinely difficult to explain away. As settlers spread west and began ploughing fields, digging cellars, levelling the ancient earthen mounds that dotted the river valleys, they began to find bones, and not ordinary bones. The newspapers of the era are full of it. This is not folklore. These are real documents, real printed pages, sitting in real archives that anyone can go and read. In county after county, state after state, Local papers ran accounts of enormous skeletons unearthed from the old mounds. Skeletons measured at 7 feet. At 8 feet, in a handful of the more breathless reports, considerably more than that, the accounts described jawbones that fit over the face of a grown man with room to spare. Thigh bones longer than any living person's, and in a scattering of these reports, repeated across decades and across hundreds of miles, the same uncanny details surfaced again and again. Extra fingers. Extra toes. 6 where there should have been 5. Picture one of those mornings. A farmer, somewhere in a river valley, decades before anyone thought to photograph such things, decides the old rise at the edge of his field has to come down so he can run a straight furrow. He sets his sons to it with shovels. They cut into the earth, and the dirt comes away in dark, packed layers, and then a shovel strikes something that is not a stone. They dig with their hands. And what they lift out of the ground is a skull, but it is wrong, too large, the brow too heavy, the jaw so wide that the eldest boy sets it over his own face like a mask, and it swallows him whole. And below it, the long bones, longer than the man is tall. The family stands in the field in silence, and someone goes to fetch the newspaper man from town, and a week later there is a column of breathless print, and then the bones are carted off, or buried again out of unease, or left to crumble in a barn, and within a generation no one can say for certain where they went, or whether they were ever really there at all. That scene, in one form or another, played out hundreds of times across the eastern half of this country. The records of it survive. The bones almost never do. Now, the careful historian has explanations for all of this, and we should be honest about them, because this story is stronger when it is honest. Some of those newspaper accounts were hoaxes, plain and simple, written to sell papers in an age when a good tall tale moved more copies than the truth. Some were honest misidentifications, where a tall but ordinary skeleton was exaggerated in the retelling, the way every fish gets bigger by the time the story reaches the tavern. And polydactyly, the medical condition of being born with extra fingers or toes, is a real and recurring genetic trait. It exists. It runs in families. It is not supernatural. All of that is true. And yet the sheer volume of these accounts, the way the same specific details recur in places far too distant to have copied one another, the way they keep landing in exactly the regions where the indigenous oral traditions already spoke of giants, has never been fully accounted for. You can dismiss any single report. Explaining away all of them, together, as nothing but error and invention, requires a kind of faith of its own. And the Cherokee account, recorded by serious men in the years around the turn of the century, was not describing a hoax in a newspaper. It was describing a memory the people themselves insisted was true. There is a piece of genuine history that sits right at the center of all this, and it is worth telling plainly, because it shows that the question of a vanished race was not invented by late-night television. For most of the 1800s, educated Americans argued bitterly about who had built the mounds. A great many of them simply could not accept that the ancestors of the native peoples they had displaced were capable of raising such enormous, organized, geometrically precise earthworks. So they invented a separate people, a lost race, a vanished civilization of superior builders who had come, flourished, and disappeared long before the tribes arrived, only to be wiped out or driven off by the very peoples the settlers now found in possession of the land. This idea was everywhere. It filled popular books. It was preached from pulpits and printed in respectable journals. And it was, of course, deeply convenient, because if a lost race of master builders had once owned the continent and been destroyed by the natives, then the settlers taking the land back were not really conquerors at all. They were restorers. The lost race theory was a story the 19th century told itself to feel better about what it was doing. Eventually, the Smithsonian's own Bureau of Ethnology set out to settle the matter, and a researcher named Cyrus Thomas spent years excavating the mounds and published a vast report in 1894, concluding that they had been built by the ancestors of living Native Americans after all. The lost race, the official verdict declared, had never existed. The case was closed. And in the strict archaeological sense, that verdict was correct and important. The mounds were the achievement of native peoples, and saying otherwise had been used to justify terrible things. But notice what the verdict did to the indigenous traditions themselves. In its rush to close the door on the racist lost race fantasy, the establishment also closed the door on the Cherokee, saying, in their own voice, that someone strange had come before. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Two ideas got swept out together, and the giants, the moon-eyed ones, the six-fingered builders, went out with the trash that deserved to go. So picture it, the early 1900s, the frontier is closing. The old people who carried the oldest stories are dying, and a handful of men understand that something is about to be lost forever. They come into the mountains with their notebooks. They sit by the fires. They ask the elders to tell them, one more time, about the ones who came before. And the elders tell them about the giants. They describe beings of great height who lived in the high country, in the caves and the deep coves where the sun rarely reached. They describe them as having come from somewhere else, somewhere to the west, or in some tellings from across the great water, in a time so distant that it sat at the very edge of memory. They describe them as builders, the makers of the mounds and the stone walls that the Cherokee themselves had inherited rather than raised. And they describe, with a consistency that is hard to wave away, the strangeness of their hands and feet, 6 fingers, 6 toes, as if the very shape of them marked them as something other than human. The men wrote it down. And then the strangest part of the whole affair began, which is that the writing seemed to go nowhere. You can search the standard histories of the region, the textbooks handed out in schools, the official accounts of who lived in these mountains and when, and you will find the Cherokee, and you will find the settlers, and you will find the mound builders described in cautious, careful terms. What you will struggle to find is the giants. What you will struggle to find is the moon-eyed ones. What you will struggle to find is any serious engagement with the question of why a sophisticated, careful people would insist, across centuries and across every independent line of testimony, that someone enormous and strange and 6-fingered had been here first. The stories did not disappear because they were disproven. They disappeared because they did not fit. And there is a difference between a thing being false and a thing being inconvenient. History is supposed to be the record of what happened. But the version of history most of us are handed is something narrower than that. It is the record of what happened that the people in charge of the records were comfortable repeating. Consider what the official story asks you to believe. It asks you to believe that the mounds, some of them rising the height of a 4-story building, some of them shaped into enormous animals visible only from the sky, were built by people who left almost no other trace of such ambition. It asks you to believe that the stone walls on the ridgelines are coincidence or natural or simply unexplained, and that unexplained is the same thing as unimportant. It asks you to believe that the indigenous accounts of a vanished predecessor race are pure metaphor, pure imagination, and that the people who lived in these mountains for thousands of years somehow invented, independently, the same detailed memory of giants that shows up in the folklore of nearly every culture on Earth, because that is the part that should stop you cold. The 6-fingered giant is not only a Cherokee story. Open the oldest book in the Western tradition, the Hebrew Scriptures, and you will find them there. In the second book of Samuel, in a battle at a place called Gath, there is a description of a great warrior of enormous stature, and the text pauses, almost as an aside, to record a specific physical detail about him. On each hand he had 6 fingers, and on each foot 6 toes, 24 in all, the same number, the same strangeness. Recorded thousands of years ago and thousands of miles away from the Smoky Mountains, by people who could not possibly have spoken to a Cherokee elder, and it does not stop with one verse in one book. The same ancient scriptures speak again and again of a vanished race of giants, the Nephilim, the Rephaim, the Anakim, people said to have towered over ordinary men and to have lived in the land before the ordinary men arrived to drive them out. Walk far enough into the old stories of almost any culture, and you find them waiting there. The Norse spoke of the frost giants who shaped the world before the gods. The Greeks remembered the Titans and the one-eyed builders of their oldest walls, stones so massive that later generations swore no human hand could have stacked them. Cultures that never met, that never traded a single word, somehow arrived at the same haunting conviction. That the world was once larger than us, that something vast came first, that we are the latecomers, walking among the ruins and the bones of a people we barely remember. The names change from one language to the next, but the shape of the memory never does, and that is precisely what makes it so difficult to dismiss. How does the same impossible detail end up in the oral tradition of the Southern Appalachians and in the war chronicles of the ancient Near East? The conventional answer is that it is coincidence, that giants are a universal fantasy, and extra fingers are a natural embellishment, and that the human imagination simply reaches for the same images. Perhaps. That is possible. But it is also possible that both records are pointing back, dimly, imperfectly, across an unimaginable gulf of time, at something that was once real, a people, a bloodline, a presence on the earth that came before the version of the past we have been allowed to keep. This is the question the Tartaria accounts circle, again and again, not whether the textbooks are lying outright, but whether the textbooks are complete, whether the story of human civilization that we have been handed, neat and linear and reassuring, has had its first and strangest chapters quietly torn out, the mounds we cannot fully explain, the walls we cannot date, the architecture, all over the world, that seems too vast, too precise, too ambitious for the hands the history books assign it to. And running underneath all of it, in the folk memory of people on every continent, the persistent, stubborn, refusing to die memory of an older race, taller than us, stranger than us. Gone now, but not gone from the stories. The Cherokee did not need a theory to believe it. They had the rock with the 7-fingered handprint. They had the wall that they knew they had not built. They had the caves their grandparents told them to stay out of, the high dark coves where, the old people said, the night-seeing ones had sheltered from the sun. They had a memory, and they kept it, and they handed it down through the generations until a few careful men in the early 1900s finally wrote it on a page. And then we lost it. Or we let it be taken. The accounts were filed, shelved, footnoted, and forgotten, allowed to gather dust precisely because they raised a question that nobody, with a reputation to protect, wanted to answer. What if the Cherokee were not telling a fairy tale? What if, when they said the giants were here before us, they meant exactly that? Think about how much would have to change. If the mounds were not the work of the ancestors of the people we found living beside them, then the whole tidy sequence of who came when starts to come apart. If there was a people in North America tall enough and old enough and strange enough to leave behind earthworks that took generations to build, and if every memory of them was carried only in oral tradition because they vanished before the written record began, then the date we like to put on the beginning of history on this continent is not a beginning at all. It is a curtain, and behind the curtain is everything we decided not to look at. The skeptics will tell you, and they are not wrong to tell you, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That a weathered carving and a wall of unknown origin and a scattering of 19th century newspaper hoaxes do not add up to a vanished race of 6-fingered giants. That the responsible thing, the rigorous thing, is to set the stories aside until something more solid turns up. But notice what that argument quietly does. It treats the testimony of the Cherokee, a people who lived in these mountains for longer than recorded European history has existed, as the weakest kind of evidence there is. It treats the consistency of the accounts, across centuries and across cultures, as meaningless noise. It treats the absence of giant skeletons in our museums as proof that there were never any giants, rather than asking the harder question of where, exactly, all those bones the newspapers described actually went. Because the bones were reported, the accounts exist. The mounds were opened. And then, In case after case, the remains are simply no longer there to examine. Lost, misplaced, reburied, never catalogued in the first place. You do not have to believe in a grand conspiracy to find that pattern unsettling. You only have to notice it. What the Cherokee left us is not proof. Let us be clear and honest about that. It is something older and in some ways heavier than proof. It is memory. The memory of a people who had no reason to lie, recorded by men who had no reason to invent, describing something that the official story of this land has never been able to either confirm or fully erase. The giant whose body pressed into the stone, the pale ones who fled the sun and were driven west into the dark, the hands with too many fingers, the walls no one will claim. Stand on one of those high ridges in the Smokies at dusk, when the light goes flat and grey and the fog begins to climb up out of the valleys, and it is not hard to understand why the people who lived here believed what they believed. The land feels old in a way that is difficult to put into words. It feels like it remembers things. It feels like it is keeping something, and the Cherokee, who knew it better than we ever will, told us plainly what they thought it was keeping. They told the men with the notebooks. They told them about the ones who came before, the tall ones, the six-fingered ones, the ones whose story we wrote down and then chose to forget. Maybe it is only a legend. Maybe the giants are nothing but the shadow that every human culture throws backward into its own deep past, a way of saying that the world was once larger and stranger than the one we were born into. That is the safe answer, and it may be the right one. But the rock is still there in Jackson County, with its carvings no one has translated. The wall is still there on Fort Mountain, running along the ridge, built by hands no historian can name. The old accounts are still there in the archives, recorded by serious men in the years around 1907, waiting in the dust for someone to take them seriously again. And the question the Cherokee left us with has never actually been answered. It has only been avoided. Who was here before us? Who built the mounds? Who left the marks in the stone? And why, on every record we can find, on every hand and every foot they described, were there always 6? The principal people said they knew. They told us what they remembered. The least we can do, all these years later, is listen to what they said and ask ourselves honestly why it was ever taken out of the story in the first place. Because that, in the end, is the real mystery here, and it is a larger one than any single skeleton in any single field. It is the question of how a memory survives and how a memory dies. The Cherokee carried theirs for centuries with no written word at all, passing it from grandparent to grandchild around 1,000 fires, keeping it whole and exact across more generations than most families can even name. They did the hard work. They kept the record alive long enough to hand it to us. And we, with our libraries and our archives and our endless ability to print and copy and store, managed to lose it almost the moment it touched the page. Not because it was disproven, because it was awkward. Because it did not flatter the story we preferred. A memory that survived 10,000 years of telling could not survive 100 years of filing. So maybe the giants were real, and maybe they were not. Maybe the 6 fingers are a true detail carried faithfully out of the deep past, or maybe they are the natural shape of awe, the way human beings have always reached for one extra impossible feature to mark the line between us and whatever came before. You can decide that for yourself. The accounts are public. The rock and the wall are still standing. Go and look, if you ever find yourself in those mountains, and make up your own mind. But do not let anyone tell you the Cherokee was simply confused. They were the keepers of this land for longer than the country that paved over their memory has even existed. When a people that careful, that ancient, that rooted in a place tells you plainly and consistently that giants walked here before them, the honest response is not to laugh. The honest response is to wonder what it would mean if they were right. The mountains are still keeping it. They have kept it for a very long time. And the fog rolls down off the high coves the way it always has, soft and slow and patient, settling over the places where the old ones swore the giants used to walk. Up there in the silence, it's easy to believe the mountains listen.